Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. One of the consequences of this COVID pandemic, of course, is the enormous economic impact, with tens of millions of Americans having filed for unemployment and a new focus on what we now call essential workers. But there is a degree to which some of these essential workers are, in the words of my guest today, coerced in their work. My guest, SUNY Buffalo sociologist Erin Hatton, who's the author of a new book called Coerced, Work Under Threat of Punishment. And she talks with me about what's going on in workplaces today, but also the subject of her book, which is a look at 4 areas of work that are really different from what the type of work that most of us think of work being. And we have a very interesting, even rollicking discussion, I would say, on these topics. It's a relevant, important discussion I think you will enjoy very much. Please, everybody, stay safe. Wear masks, despite what some people are saying. Be safe. Take care of yourselves and your family, and enjoy this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. With nearly 40 million Americans having filed for unemployment because they've lost their jobs during the couple of months of this economic shutdown during the pandemic, issues of work and safety in work in the workplace have become so much more visible and present and threatening. So question, what do people do who have some pressure on them to work and to work in certain conditions? Or in the words of my guest today, Erin Hatton, how are people coerced in work and coerced to work? So first of all, Erin, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. Fascinating topic that I'm really looking forward to talking about with you.
Hi, yes, thanks for having me.
Your book, which has just been released, is called Coerced: Work Under Threat of Punishment. And I don't think when you wrote the book, you could even have imagined, nor could any of us have imagined, what we're going through right now, especially these last several months. But it does seem like the topic is only more and more relevant today than ever. So very opportune for us to be able to talk about it. Um, I thought maybe you could start, Erin, by giving us a little background on yourself, because this is a law podcast. We talk about the law in many, many unlimited number of ways that the law matters to people. But mostly we have lawyers and judges and law professors talking about the law, and you are not a lawyer, as I understand it. So
That's right.
That's a good thing, and I'm pleased to have a non-lawyer on the podcast. So give us a little background on yourself and how you came through your work, your research, your teaching to this important issue.
Yeah, sure. So I am a sociologist. All of my research and much of my teaching centers on issues of work and labor. But that means that I also have a lot of overlap with other topics, including law. And so sociology of law is, of course, a big area. And so that's part of my research, as well as focusing on issues of inequality and culture and public policy. So I stretch out from researching and thinking deeply about work and labor. And as this book is about issues of power and vulnerability at work, and then stretching into other areas like law.
And you teach at SUNY Buffalo, is that right?
That's right. I teach in the sociology department at SUNY Buffalo.
Okay. So, well, I want to get into the book, and you have a very convenient framework in which you operate in the book, and use this framework to work through your analysis of vulnerable people who work under conditions that most people do not work under. but I thought because what is happening over these last several months is so dramatic and has had such a profound and deep impact on work. Um, maybe you could talk a little bit, and then we'll get to the some of the specifics of the work that you lay out in your book. But maybe
Sure.
start with the more the news, I guess, which are how,
Yeah.
because we've heard a lot about, for instance, people in the meatpacking industry. Certainly, you can imagine people who are farm workers and have to, pick lettuce and pick the food that we still need to eat. Uh, you know, I'm a lawyer. I can work remotely. It's not easy. It's not the same. There are many challenges, but I can do it. You're an academic and an author. You can work remotely with inconvenience. Folks on CNN and Fox and our politicians. We can. A lot of people can get through this, even though it's very challenging. But there are those who can't work remotely. They have to be in the work environment. So how do issues of coercion play into what so many people are experiencing today, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's central to so much of the work experience at this moment. Because what we're in right now is not only a major public health crisis, it's also an economic crisis, of course. Unemployment has gone through the roof and people are struggling. And so we see over and over again workers having to make, it's choice in quotation marks, like the impossible choice between working in sometimes dangerous conditions, potentially putting themselves at risk for exposure to the coronavirus, or not being able to feed their families. And so this, of course, is not a choice at all, right? It's economic coercion. And so it puts workers are in a very vulnerable position. But, at the same time, there are a couple of silver linings to this crisis. I don't want to overstate them, but it is true that we have gained, at least momentarily, a new recognition of the importance of these workers. We've called
Mm-hmm.
them essential. Um, and the service economy has long now been the backbone of our economy, and so we are really only as strong as our service economy, as our frontline service sector workers are. And so there is new recognition of kind of their importance. Um, but they're at risk. And yet another silver lining with this increased awareness of their importance is, at least in some workplaces, workers have been able to leverage their newfound power to make demands on their workplaces for safety, right? To protect them, because no one should be put in at risk in the workplace. So there are a few silver linings in this moment of change, but it is definitely one in which people are under coercion because sometimes they have to make that difficult or impossible choice between having to work in risky jobs and having to feed their families.
Well, and right, and I mean, but on some level, that's always been true, right? I mean,
That's right.
people have worked in dangerous occupations as long as there's been work, and uh, hopefully over the course of time, uh, as we become more aware of the dangers that some people face at work. I'm thinking of coal miners. I'm thinking of police officers, or so many other uh, types of work that you can imagine. Hopefully, we get more aware, and as legislators become more aware, and the courts become more aware, and people who are in those work environments have more leverage and more power, more of a voice, you can improve safety. But uh, these seem like a really extraordinary time for these workers, and it's not only risking exposure for themselves. I mean, I think there's been a significant number of children of healthcare frontline healthcare workers, or children of first line responders in New York City, for example. So it's fear of exposing yourself, but also of exposing your families.
That's absolutely right. And it is, of course, true that some jobs are inherently riskier than others. But those jobs have only been made safer over time through worker agitation and then legislation. Um, and so that is something we've seen out of this crisis, is that some new agitation in those areas that were previously often unorganized, considered disposable, replaceable, they are now pushing for protection, so that it's not the fact that we can make all jobs totally safe, but no worker should be put at undue risk in the workplace. So to mitigate risks that they're put under.
Well, and interestingly, recognition is nice, whether it's on the personal or the professional level. I mean, it's hard to imagine somebody wouldn't appreciate that. Um, and being called essential is a form of recognition. But of course, the ultimate recognition is compensation, benefits, things of that nature. And I think we've seen some calls in some places in a very limited basis for actually recognizing the not only essential work but the indispensable work. I mean, if you want to have a disinfected environment, workplace, store, whatever, you've got to have somebody who's going in and doing the disinfecting. I mean, we've never really thought much about those workers, but now we think of them in a different way. Do you see some of these positions, because of this experience, perhaps gaining something that would go along with recognition and actually feel good in the pocketbook?
Oh, I certainly hope so, and we have seen that. I personally am not a fan of the rhetoric around heroes and recognition and essentials without anything that is added to the pocketbook. Right? I think so often that rhetoric is used in lieu of real recognition, monetary recognition.
Mm.
But for the most part, with some real pushing, employers did respond, and Kroger instituted hero pay and so on. Though of course they later revoked it. Um, so yes, I believe in that type of recognition that comes with paying for the value of people's labor. Um, that stems from that recognition, but not ends with it.
Right. Okay. Well, so let's talk about your book then. 'Cause you look at four different areas of work, um, and then have a certain perspective in how you're looking at these different areas of work with an eye, as I read the book, to understanding how people are coerced, and more than just the pressure we all feel to work, because we need to work to earn money to feed ourselves and our families, and have the basics of life, and maybe a little more, but coerced in a different way than most people may feel like, ugh, I've got to be here till Friday and it's only Tuesday. So tell us what you mean by the term coerced as you
Sure.
apply it to these four different groups.
Yeah. So, first of all workers to a greater or lesser degree experience, as you say, a certain type of coercion. And that's economic coercion. Right? We have to work in order to survive in this capitalist economy. That's kind of a given. Now we have put in a number of protections that kind of mitigate employers' coercive power. So, you can file for unemployment benefits, you can get welfare, and so on. It's not a very strong safety net, but there is a safety net in place to kind of decrease employers' powers of economic coercion. But the workers that I studied for this book also experience a different type of coercion because, and one reason they do so is, in fact, because they are not workers or deemed to be workers under labor and employment law, right? So I studied prisoners who labor behind bars. I
Mm-hmm.
studied workfare workers who are required to perform labor in order to receive public assistance.
Mm-hmm.
I studied Division I college football players and basketball players. And I studied graduate students in the sciences who labor in their advisors' labs for their research and their education.
Mm-hmm.
So for these workers, at least for the last two students groups, it's not that they are compelled to work, right? No one has to go to graduate school. No one has to go be a Division I football player. What I argue in this book, and of course I should say that, of course, these four groups of workers are radically different in so many ways, right? I'm not suggesting that graduate students are like prisoners or that football players are like prisoners, welfare recipients, right? That's absurd. But I do identify a type of coercion that shapes their experiences in the workplace, much like, like day laborers and middle-level managers both experience economic coercion, but to different degrees, right? So it's similar in kind, but not in intensity. And so that's the type of coercion these workers that I'm studying experience. So I call it not economic coercion, but status coercion.
Mm-hmm.
Because the main power that their bosses wield is not about like firing them and taking away their wages. Some of them don't even get paid at all. Or if they do, it's relatively nominal. And whatever they get paid is important to them. They still experience economic coercion, to be sure. But on top of that, their bosses can also kick them out of that status. So let's take prisoners, for example. Okay, no one wants to be a prisoner, right? No one desires that status.
Right. I think that should be a given. Yes.
Right, that's a given. We can all agree
Yeah.
to that, if nothing else. But once you're living and working behind bars, you kind of your whole life depends on maintaining your status as a prisoner in good standing, because with that you get to visit your family. You can call them. You can hang out with your friends behind bars. You can go to recreation. You can buy food from the commissary. And you're not in solitary confinement, right? You have some freedom of movement, some freedom of recreation. You get all of the basic human entitlements that become privileges behind bars if you are a prisoner in good standing. But that can be taken away, and you can be thrown in solitary confinement, for example, which means being put in an enclosed cell away from everyone else for 23 hours a day without human interaction. And ethicists say that if you're in solitary confinement for more than 14 or 15 days, that is legally defined as torture. Like, this is not a good consequence. And yet, prisoners can be put in solitary confinement for any infraction, including not doing the job right. And by the way, all prisoners, or at least in New York State and across the U.S., nearly all able-bodied prisoners are expected to work in some job. And so their boss has this power, this vast power over them, not just like firing them so that they lose their 10 cents an hour, which is important, don't get me wrong, but it's also that they can wield all these other levers of power, including throwing them in solitary confinement for an undetermined amount of time, usually a month, but in fact, there's no limit.
Well, let me ask you about that, because obviously, if you've committed a crime and you're serving time for that crime, there's no question that you one of the consequences of that is that you lose certain rights. I mean, you for starters lose your right to freedom, and there are many other rights that you lose as well. If we if we if we take solitary confinement out of the picture, because I mean, personally, I agree, solitary is a horrible form of punishment to those who are already being punished. But if we just take that away for argument's sake and say, if a prisoner refuses to work as required, there's going to be some adverse consequence to the prisoner. I mean, do you have less of a problem with that?
Okay, let's see. Not really, for a couple of reasons, but there are a couple of caveats that I need to insert here.
Okay.
One is, it's very, very difficult for me to put solitary confinement off the table because this is a consequence that's levied so often for prisoners. That is like the go-to punishment. So the fact that it happens so often and it happens so easily. And I'm not saying that they're refusing to work. I'm saying, for example, one former prisoner that I interviewed um, fell asleep at work because he was sick. He got in trouble. He apologized. Um, and then the next day, so that was an incident that was done. The next day, his boss thought that he was asleep again. His hat was down low. The prisoner claims that he wasn't. But his boss gets really mad and says, "You know what I want as punishment? You need to clean the floors with a toothbrush." And the prisoner was like, "No way, man. That's too demeaning, right?" So it's not that they're necessarily refusing just any type of work. In fact, most of the prisoners I interviewed, along with nearly all of the workers I interviewed, they believe in work, right? They are Americans, and as Americans, we profoundly believe in the cultural importance, the dignity, the self-worth that labor gives us. They believe in it. They want to do it. They just want it to be rendered meaningful and dignifying and not take away their respect. But that was the goal of this punishment, right? He wanted him to clean the floor with a toothbrush. And the guy that I interviewed was like, "No way, I'm not doing it. Take me to the box. Take me to solitary confinement." Which is what happened. He was put in the box for 30 days as punishment because he refused to do it. So okay, but with that caveat aside, back to your original point, let's remove solitary confinement from the equation. The thing is that let's take the most benign punishment that officers can wield. That's giving prisoners a ticket. It's usually a $5 fine for a level 1 offense. And $5 is no small amount, right? So that's about a week's worth of wages behind bars in New York State prisons. But here's the catch. You might say, well, okay, that's not too bad, except for the fact that if you have too many tickets, you're not going to get out of prison. You're not going to get, you will eventually get out, but you're not going to be released for good behavior because you won't have been behaving well. You're not going to get on parole. So even just the most benign punishment, giving a ticket, can lead prisoners to lose that status of good prisoner, which can lead them to get out of prison earlier, and sometimes, not insignificantly earlier. So it matters. The punishments they wield matter, not just like, oh, it's a shitty punishment, but it matters like keeping them locked up for longer, separating them from their families through isolation, making them suffer kind of physical and mental health consequences from solitary confinement, but just incarceration in general. Those consequences matter.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to think through is as I read your book, it's almost like, and I think you alluded to this earlier as well, it's almost like the the people who quote unquote work in these areas, it's not actually work on some level because of the degree of coercion and because of the threat of the particular kinds of threats of punishment that can be applied to these people. They don't have labor unions. They don't have the right to, have grievances. They don't have any. Many of them don't have any rights at all as far as their work. But I guess what I'm thinking about is what really is work in these different environments. So, for example, in the prisoner case, could it be argued that work isn't really about work the way people out of prison work, where you contract for your labor and you get a certain pay and you're expected to perform to a certain standard? And evidence of that is the fact that they get away with being paid pennies, not in pennies, not dollars. Isn't work in the prison environment, at least arguably or theoretically, part of the deal, part of the bargain, and part of trying to rehabilitate and trying to raise people or teach people of the value of work so that when they get out, they have skills, they have learned something about the meaning of work and so on. I mean, is there an argument that it's okay that it's not work in the way that work is understood in other contexts?
Well, that's certainly how the criminal justice system has devised it. But the fact of the matter is, how we define work, both legally and socially, is socially constructed, by which I mean that it is constructed by the society in which we live. So it's not a given. You started off asking, what is the meaning of work? Is it, they don't get to have unions and bargain collectively? Well, I mean, by those measures, most of our workforce would not be workers, right? Now, it is true that prisoners are not legally deemed to be workers and are therefore not legally protected by labor and employment law because their labor is seen as not part of an economic relationship. So that is the determination that the legal system and the criminal justice system has put forth. But that's relying on a pretty narrow definition of what work is, because in fact, they are performing productive labor. And that if they didn't perform it, the prison system would have to hire civilians at much, much greater expense. They effectively keep the prisons running. So they are doing a lot of labor there, serving food.
Yeah, but what's wrong with that? Because, I mean, they committed a crime. They require care. Somebody's got to pay for that care, except leaving private prisons aside, which is a whole other discussion. Taxpayers ultimately have to pay for their food, for the upkeep, for the operation of the prison, for the salaries of the guards, and so on. I mean, why shouldn't they contribute in some way through work or through labor to the cost of maintaining the system that they made necessary?
Sure. Well, I'm putting your last comment aside because I'm not at all sure that prisoners themselves made this prison system necessary. They're a product rather than a cause of the criminal justice system. But okay, we'll put that in brackets.
Okay.
I am not at all against prison labor. At all I'm examining in this book, and because in point of fact, for many prisoners, labor, working behind bars can be really important. I mean, life behind bars is stultifying.
Yeah.
So having something to do, having something meaningful to do, being able to forge relationships with others is incredibly important.
Right.
But I would argue, so what I do in the book is that I examine the power relationships, the power dynamics of that labor relation. And I point out some of what I see as problems of that relationship. So that the fact that officers kind of wield this expansive power over them with no one kind of looking over their shoulder. Like there are no HR departments behind bars looking over officers' shoulders as labor bosses, right? And although there is a grievance system, as one prisoner said to me, he was like, yeah, sure, you can file a grievance, but you're just grieving the same people who grieved you. So without any kind of controls on that relationship, which is a labor relationship, that some abuse can go unchecked, right? And as so many prisoners told me, they're like, look, officers aren't all bad. Some are really good. And some told me in great detail about the meaningful relationships they forged with their bosses, with officers. That's not necessarily the problem. The problem is that there's a power dynamic there, and there's nothing to keep it in check. Nothing. And so for those who are abusive, they're extremely abusive. And that's the problem. And so, no, I'm not against prison labor. I would not argue that it should be a part of punishment. But I'm definitely not against prison labor per se.
Well, yeah, no, I didn't mean to suggest you were. And I think you raised a really important point about, because coercion is really coercion. You can't coerce somebody in any way unless there's some threat about what will happen if the person doesn't submit to your coercion. And so that's why I guess I was asking initially about the solitary confinement, because that is an incredibly powerful threat, the threat of solitary. And it's very controversial. And there's been a lot of conversation about the potential for excesses and abuse and the impact of solitary, all of which you discuss. But even, I mean, if you're going to accept as a premise that we have a system of crime and punishment, then I mean, those power relationships are important, but there have to be some consequences for people not doing things that they're expected to do. I mean, if I don't do what I'm expected to do, my business will fail. I will lose my job. I will lose my case. There's always some consequence that will result from not doing something you're expected to do, and
That's true.
yeah,
Although I will say that you receive both the benefits of when you do it and do it well, as well as the consequences if you don't do it or don't do it well.
that's true.
And that's clearly
True.
not the case for prisoners, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I would argue that prison labor should be reconstrued to give them real skills that are transferable to life after bars. Like,
Yeah.
people use this rhetoric of rehabilitation and skills transfer all the time, and it just doesn't pan out for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just simply not the case that what they're doing behind bars gets them a job afterwards. We know that.
Yeah. Because they're not getting
So
real training. They're not getting real skills.
for the most part, they are not. That's
Yeah.
right.
Well, okay, let's talk about workfare because that's another really interesting and long controversial aspect of work or type of work. So tell us about that one.
Sure. So, this was a program that was radically expanded, welfare reform in 1996. And then, in various places, it's kind of ebbed and flowed since. New York City had a very large program until relatively recently. The mayor announced that he was going to close the kind of most clear-cut iteration of that program. And so, in this program, in general, in order to receive public assistance, um, if typically welfare applicants are required to apply for, I don't know what, 60 jobs in 60 days or something like that. And if they don't find a job, then they will likely be assigned to some kind of, quote, work activity, in which they're expected to show up for perhaps 25 or 35 hours a week, and perform some type of labor. Often it's cleaning up trash, picking up cigarette butts in the parks. I know in New York City, for example, at least they used to clean subway cars. And so they would be assigned to work in order to receive, like they had to do this in order to receive any form of public assistance that they were getting. So this includes not only cash benefits, but also utility vouchers and so on. And for the time in which they were at work, they could also get some transportation vouchers and child care assistance for the hours while they were at work. And then, of course, no child care after they were done, so they couldn't actually go out and look for a job.
Okay, so right, and this was a big change because there wasn't a work requirement to receiving public assistance through one of the many programs until these changes came about. So, um, why is that not? I mean, clearly, I guess the coercive part of that relationship is if you don't fulfill the work requirement, you won't get the public assistance. That's
That's
pretty
right.
intimidating if that public assistance is what you need to buy food for your children or um, have any kind of income at all to provide for yourself and for your family. I mean, that's pretty harsh
That's right. So if
if you
there's
look
any
at that.
infraction, you'll be sanctioned. And it's not even just a matter of not doing the work. It's perhaps not, calling in saying you're sick. And then when you come next, depending on who your boss is and how they're feeling that day, maybe if you don't have a doctor's note, they're going to sanction you. And what that typically means is for a first offense, you're cut off from welfare benefits for 30 days. You get nothing. Although your lifetime allotment of benefits keeps on going, right? So with TANF, the new law in 1996, they talked a whole lot about the 60-month clock for which people could get benefits. That's a lifetime 5-year limit on TANF. So if you're sanctioned, your tennis clock keeps ticking, but you get nothing. And for first offense, it's often 30 days. For a second offense, it's often 60 days. Third offense, 90 days. And then you can be cut off permanently. And just as behind bars, people are sanctioned for all sorts of reasons, not people who sit down and say, I refuse to do this. It's people who have childcare issues, who have sick children or are sick themselves, or get in an argument with their boss, or any sort of thing. Their boss has this expansive power over them to kick them out of welfare, kick them off the measly social safety net that we have. And there's no one looking over their shoulder to make sure they're doing it properly, to make sure they're not abusing their power.
Okay, so let me break this into two. This sort of similar question that I had about the work, the case of prisoners and their labor. Now that I've been enlightened, I hesitate to call it work. But so in the case of people who are on public assistance, again, I mean, every employee is vulnerable to some forms of coercion and to some power relationship with somebody who has more power, namely the employer. So here, what do you is your concern that there is any kind of work requirement, or is your concern more how that power is exercised, such as when you said with little oversight of how that power is exercised?
Well, my concern in the book is how that power is exercised, but I would also argue very readily that that workfare as a program is both punitive and completely ineffective. So if your goal is to get people into the workforce, this is not a strategy to do so. In fact, it's antithetical to that goal because it prevents them from being able to attain skills for any job, and it also prevents them from having any time to find jobs, to apply for jobs. So it's completely antithetical if your goal is to get them employed. But that's not their goal. The goal of TANF was well, it's quite punitive, and to instill personal responsibility and to make them work, right? So it was very symbolic and forcing them to perform labor. But, the assumption of that is that these folks don't already want to work, don't already know how to work, don't already have a work ethic. And that studies show over and over and over again that that's simply not the case. So I do not think that work should be the centerpiece, that kind of this mandatory coercive labor should be the centerpiece of a welfare system. I do think that helping people find employment, helping people gain skills to get sustainable employment is an important, or would be an important part of any welfare system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the training, job skills, education. Um, I mean, but at the same time, I can see that there could be, and I'm not so familiar with the studies that show that people, or what those studies say about people on welfare or public assistance in terms of how seriously they try to work. I mean, I can say anecdotally as a lawyer, I mean, I receive hundreds and hundreds of inquiries about potential cases, and when I get to the part asking people what kind of work do you do, and if they say I'm on disability, for example, so form of public assistance, I always ask, what is your disability? And I can tell you that I'm often surprised, not pleasantly, that people claim a disability that doesn't really disable them from working. And that I find that bothersome. So
Well,
I don't I think there should be some way to see a uh, a reasonable requirement. Maybe it's a requirement to do some amount of work and receive some amount of training as well, but to have a safety net that doesn't in any way contain some I mean, you could call it punitive, but it could also be called motivational. If it's exercised reasonably, and I'm not arguing for
Hmm. Yeah,
unreasonable pressure, but again, I've just seen a lot. I've seen over the years lots of people, and I think that's it. I mean, okay, maybe there are certain things you can't do, but there is work that you can do for sure.
sure. And I will say one that people who are doing workfare are not eligible for disability. The people that I've talked to and the people that are, I would encourage you to search out studies. Both, I don't know the data on the disability population or people who receive SSI. I would assume that this bears this out as well, but the anecdotes aside, most people like us want to work and find dignity, value, and meaning in work. And so the problem arises that so people in workfare aren't aren't disabled and aren't claiming disability and aren't eligible for
Right, right.
benefits. So they are put to work in part because they are not, but they can't find a job. That's why they're put to work, and they need help. They're in crisis.
Yeah.
They have children to support, and they believe in work. And the problem arises that they're not put in meaningful work; they're put into busy work. Um, so they'll send a van full of, I don't know, 16 people out to a park where they'll pick up some trash for a couple hours. It's it's like busy work. It's making them do something for the sake of having them do something, but they're not getting any skills. As one workfare worker I interviewed said, "Look, no one's going to hire me because I picked up the most trash out in the park today. That's absurd, right? How am I going to find a job?" They were so deeply frustrated by having to spend their days, their only hours where they had childcare support, doing this crappy mate work that left them feeling deeply disrespected and deeply frustrated because they believe in the value of meaningful work.
Yeah, but some. I mean, I'm not disagreeing really with you. I'm pushing back for because
Sure.
just to see how these arguments really play out. But I mean, some of those people who pick up trash are now called essential workers. I mean,
Look,
so
I'm not against dealing with refuse and trash like as a job. Like that's an important job for, especially for any city.
yeah,
But garbage collectors get paid a pretty decent amount. These workfare workers, I mean, if you break it down, if you are including their food stamps and break it down by the hourly, they're getting well below minimum wage. They're just not getting that much. And the problem is, so they're not only laboring under economic coercion, right? That's the revoking of their benefits to support themselves, but they're also laboring under this other form of coercion that I talked about. Like their boss can take away the social safety net from under their feet, pulling the rug from under their feet. Many people that I talked to had ended up homeless. And I should note, people are sanctioned all the time, and the system is rife with mistakes, like tons and tons of mistakes, because it's an incredibly complicated, unnecessarily complex bureaucracy. People are sanctioned for any kind of reason. If they didn't show up for a meeting, if they didn't have a letter, whatever. Half the time they don't even know why they're sanctioned. It's that needlessly complex. And much of the time, it's incorrect, the reasons why they're sanctioned, but it's too difficult to fight, so they don't. They just sit it out. But then what happens to a significant portion of them? They end up homeless with their children. And by the way, if you are already living in a homeless shelter in New York City and you're receiving welfare, but then you are sanctioned, you get kicked out of the homeless shelter and you and your kids end up on the street.
well, I mean, on the issue of training, because I agree, I think that's so important. There are other programs available, say, to someone who's on workfare, and they're on workfare. I gave a different example of disability, but I know, I mean, workfare would apply to people who receive what we used to call food stamps or benefits for children and things like that, or Medicaid. Um, aren't there also training programs training services and different funds for those types of programs, or do you think there's uh, So I guess what I'm asking is if there are, is what you're looking at really just the, I don't mean just like that's a little thing. I mean, but are you looking at the relationship between people in these work like situations where they face a certain different kind of punishment than others in more conventional work relationships would experience?
That's right. So I was really focusing in this book on people who labor in these, well, I call them work relations, but
Mhm.
under the law, they are work like relations. um, and yes, so other uh, recipients of public assistance they don't all do this type of labor, right? They're not all assigned to work activities. There are other programs available. Um, Oftentimes still the training is not very robust or readily available, but there are other programs available, right? Not all welfare recipients are required to labor in this way.
Right. Okay. Well, I have to say the one that to me seemed so clear, and not that these others aren't clear, but that was almost like on a marquee flashing lights at me was your look at college athletes. And I know there's been some changes in that too, at least in some parts of the college athlete community. So you looked at college football players and college basketball players, both men and women in college basketball. I mean, what seems so different about this is although these athletes, yes, are being given an opportunity to play, um, probably a lot of them are also getting some kind of scholarship to help them with the academic side of their college experience. Hopefully, there is an academic side for them. Um, but particularly at some of the bigger schools, these schools are making so much money off of these college athletes. And that seems really different from the other examples that we've talked about. So, do you agree that's different? And why is that important? Why is that difference important?
Well, actually, I mean, it's a matter of scale. So in all of these cases, the four groups of workers that I analyzed, they are laboring for the monetary benefit of someone else. So even if they get a little bit of pay, like a graduate student stipend or 10 cents an hour as a prisoner, right? That money matters for them. But their labor is devalued. They are paid less than the value of their labor, and they're laboring for the monetary benefit of others. Now, in the case of especially the remunerative sports, um, football and basketball, right? This is such a clear case because the NC2A, some universities, though certainly not all, their coaches, they're making tons, and also advertisers and corporations and video game makers and so on. They're making so much money off of these players, while the players themselves, aside from their scholarships, um, are in fact overtly disallowed from making a cent.
Yeah, I mean it's the schools, and you're right. It's also all the people, all the adults, I guess. I remember when at one point I was looking at Penn State's numbers, and Joe Paterno was the highest paid employee of Penn State University. I think at the time I looked at it, he was making $5 million a year to be a football coach, to play a
Right, that's
game.
not uncommon.
So lots of people are making lots of money, big money, off these
That's right.
college athletes. Um, and so what, I guess I'm asking it almost like a sixth grader would ask the question, what's wrong with that? I mean, why is that a bad thing? These athletes get on television, they get NFL contracts or NBA contracts, um, they get
Sure,
all kinds of status on campus, they're doing something they love. I mean, so it's not like they're
sure.
getting nothing out of the bargain. They're getting many good things, actually.
That's right. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
what's wrong with that?
Well, the problem arises when I mean the thing is like the other bosses, coaches. No one's like looking over coaches' shoulders as if it were an HR department, making sure they treat their workers okay. And there's no one, athletes have no one to turn to. I mean, maybe on paper they might, maybe, but effectively no one to turn to if things get rough for them. So here's the thing. You're absolutely right that being a Division I football player or basketball player, especially at the top teams, like that's an incredibly elite status. And they get a fair number of perks. You know, they're often getting a free ride through college. And maybe they're, you know, stars on campus and so on. People are wearing their jerseys and putting up their posters. But there are a lot of restrictions with their status. So, for example, if you're a well-known football player, you can't make money over the summer by running a camp using your name, because that's your brand, and you don't own your brand as an NC2A athlete, and you can't profit from your brand. That would be in violation of NC2A rules. So your economic mobility and your economic freedoms are severely restricted. Let's say your family is incredibly poor and they need the support. How can you help them? You basically can't. And yes, maybe you're a star on campus, but you also need to work, and it is work. Well, theoretically, you're not supposed to work more than 20 hours a week, but they're working more than that. Mm-hmm. And you can't major in what you want to major in. You can't be an engineering major or an art major because those classes conflict with your football schedule. So you have to major in, as one football player told me, you have to major in sociology. Here, let's put you over in this easy discipline.
You play football?
Because that's what he said, yes. And so, you know, you can't do, like, you don't have academic freedom either because your whole life is explicitly expected to revolve around football. And here's the thing, this is an incredibly elite status, and they know it. This is what they've dreamed for. And because 98 or 99% of players do not go on to play professionally, this is the apex of their career. And they've worked their asses off to be here. But the fact of the matter is, their coach can take it away at the drop of the hat. They can, first of all, they can not play you in any given game. They can sit you out for the season. They can revoke your scholarship. They can take away that status. And that's why I call it status coercion, because it's not just about like taking away their money, which is economic coercion, which is really important, right? Money is important. But that status for them comes with all of these privileges as well as constraints. That is really important. They need to be an athlete in good standing. And so for athletes in particular, and a number of the athletes I talked to, some of them hadn't been in college for years, let's say 5-7 years. They were still scared about saying anything bad about their coach. And this is totally anonymous, right? I'm not going to steal anyone's name, anyone's university. Wow. There is deep fear in them about saying anything bad about their coach and the power dynamics involved. And by the way, another really important mechanism of power is that they can push you to play through injuries. They can potentially wreck your body for life. So that's a great deal of power indeed.
Well, we didn't really have time to talk as much about academia and graduate students, but people should get the book, and you can read a much lengthier discussion of all these fascinating points. The book again is called Coerced: Work Under Threat of Punishment, University of California Press, my home state, by sociologist and SUNY Buffalo professor Erin Hatton, who's been my guest and very tolerant of my probing and challenging questions. I appreciate that so much. And a great conversation on really something that we're already thinking about in some different ways and maybe need to think more and not just clap for some of these people, which is a good thing too, but maybe we should do more than that and understand better how these relationships work. So thanks for taking the time to speak with me on Good Law, Bad Law. We'll put a link to the book in the description for the episode, Erin, so people can easily pick up a copy. And again, thank you so much. It was great.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It was great.